So this is the point in the proceedings where I'm actually going to put you to work, because we're going to take a vote at the end of this session, and you're going to be required to make a decision about astronauts or robots. So this is the point at which I get to invite a very good friend up to the stage. So if Chris, you would mind joining me up here. So some years ago now, Chris and I were invited to participate in a debate where we would separately present the merits of astronautics and astronauts going out to explore the solar system, or in my case, the benefits of robots doing the same sort of task. And we had a public debate. A vote was taken at the end of that debate. Somewhat to my surprise, I was on the winning side. That was a good result from my point of view.
Bunch of engineers.
However, we decided that we would do a rematch. The rematch was held at the British Interplanetary Society's headquarters in Vauxhall. No disrespect to anybody from the British Interplanetary Society who's here, but I kind of expected to lose, and I did, because they're all very, very enthusiastic about astronauts. This is the decider. This is the third time we've done it. This decides the issue. You are going to decide the issue for us. Okay, so we're going to spend 15 minutes presenting the relative merits of astronauts or robots, and then we're going to ask you to take a vote. Yeah. We've arranged with the audio-visual, so we're going to determine the order that we go in randomly. Heads or tails, Chris?
Well, I'm for humans, so heads, obviously.
It's tails.
It's tails. Well, there you go.
I'm going to put you into bat first, if that's all right. So if we could have Chris's presentation up first. Chris, you have 15 minutes. Okay. It's all yours.
Well, just remember, with great power comes great responsibility when you come to vote. So, why humans must explore space? I should say, to start off with, I'm not really in the either-or camp. It's not like it's, for me, a binary choice between humans and robots. I would expect humans and robots, but there does seem to be a suggestion that it's a waste of time, money, resources sending humans into space. So I will tell you why I think humans must explore space. This is a picture of the Earth, relevant after the last talk, the blue marble. This is a picture that was taken in 1972 by the crew of Apollo 17 as they left Earth to be the final human mission to the moon. I must admit, if you had told me at that time that we wouldn't have been back by then, I would be deeply, deeply depressed. It was really the first unobstructed view of the whole Earth taken by human beings. It was an iconic view at the time. It formed views of the sort of environmental movement that was burgeoning at that point. And it's sad to relate, okay, that no human beings have been in a position to take a similar picture, not directly. Obviously, we can do this using spacecraft. So we've come probably nowhere since the 1970s in terms of human beings moving beyond low Earth orbit. Many of you will recognize this man, Carl Sagan. In 1977, he was standing where I am now, giving the Royal Institution Christmas lectures. At a time when I was 17, it was deeply, deeply inspirational, I think, for many of us. Those of us who are older will recall his Cosmos television series and the related public outreach he did. He was a planetary scientist. And sometimes you may get the impression that planetary scientists are not interested in human spaceflight. I think this is a bit of a misnomer. It's a bit inaccurate, but Carl Sagan, certainly wasn't of that view. So this is a photo here, okay, just that little dot there, that he had caused to be taken of Earth from Voyager when it was 6 billion kilometers away from Earth. And again, it's famous as the pale blue dot picture. So that's just there. And what he said of it was, if I can move this so I can read it, look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you have ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. And he says more about joy, suffering, every politician's supreme leader. But that is the point. That is the sum total of humanity. We are that little dot. That is the biggest part of the universe that we occupy, that little dot. And it's a fragile dot. Okay? In 1993, Sagan published this book called Pale Blue Dot. This was 1 year after comet Shoemaker-Levy crashed into Jupiter, and he used this as an opportunity to emphasize the danger to humanity from asteroid and cometary impact. And we'll be hearing more about that from Jay Tate this afternoon, who is a specialist with SpaceGuard UK. So he was fairly clear that in his book he said, in order to survive, okay, we need to explore and colonize space. And that is the crux of my argument. Not, is it more cost efficient to explore with the solar system and space, okay, using robots? It's a matter of species survival. On balance, I like humans, not all of them, but most of them seem okay to me. And I would hate the fact that one or two of them occasionally wind me up, to be a justification for not trying to save the species. So that is the crux of the argument. If we stay here, ultimately the human species will cease to be. But it's not just me and Carl. It's not a couple of people whose names both begin with C who think that we should travel into space. I can cite other people more expert than myself. Sir Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, and again, sometimes people think that astronomers, just want to kind of look up at little dots in the sky and aren't really interested in anything else. But in 2003, he wrote this book called Our Final Century. And he predicts that one of two things will happen to us this century, either, okay, we will become extinct because of runaway effects of new technology, global violence of a number of possible sorts, destruction of the biosphere, or the alternative, we expand into space and attempt to minimize, avoid, overcome these existential threats. There are a whole bunch of risks to human civilization. Asteroid impact we've mentioned. Historically, there have been periods of large-scale volcanism on the planet, which would cause the equivalent of nuclear winter. If one wants to get a bit sci-fi, wandering singularities and black holes, maybe gamma ray bursters nearby in the galaxy. All of these things are things which could terminate humanity. Even our friendly sun. I mean, we know, for sure that in I think it's several billion years' time, the sun will expand as a red giant, and where we are standing and sitting now will be inside the surface of the sun. So if we stay here, we are going to die. That's the long and short of it. Fortunately, we have some millions, billions of years, but you can never start too soon, in my opinion. Because even if we wait for the sun to kill us, there's plenty of other things that could kill us beforehand, How many of you have insurance policies on your houses? Yeah, as I thought, so you're obviously fans of insurance. So what I'm proposing is that we try and take out, to the best of our ability, an insurance policy for the human species, that we don't keep ourselves on the surface of the planet. Another person who agrees with this point of view, Stephen Hawking, who very, very kindly arranged to say something about this earlier this week. I was particularly blessed by that, or the fact that he's apparently going to make a television program on this subject for the BBC, which will be shown as part of their Tomorrow's World series. Life on Earth is at an ever-increasing risk of being wiped out. If you want a little bit of kind of cheerful nighttime reading, this book here, Global Catastrophic Risks. I should tell you, I started reading it in the evening, and then I kept having these rather depressing dreams, okay? But this book is an academic summary of all the ways that the human species could render itself extinct or could be rendered extinct. So there's lots of things that can go wrong. So, he is fairly clear. He says he thinks if the human race has no future if it doesn't go into space. And you will see a TV program in the not-too-distant future. I don't know when it's on, but watch out for that. So what about us in the UK? I've had the kind of global doom kind of image. What can we do in the UK? Well, a few British people have been to space already. Most technically British born, rather than necessarily currently British. So Helen Sharman, of course, Michael Fole, British born, Mark Shuttleworth, South African internet millionaire, the sadly recently deceased Piers Sellers, Nick Patrick, Richard Garriott, another entrepreneur, Lord British in his online identity, and most recently, of course, our very own Tim Peake. They've all been into space, but they've all come back again. So in terms of continuing the species, that doesn't help us a great deal. It's a good first step. What about the cost? People say space is expensive. Well, kind of last year, the UK spent about £350 million on space programs. Now, if I had £350 million, I would count myself a rich person. There's no doubt about that. 10 million of that approximately was spent on human spaceflight. Even if I had 10 million, I think I was doing quite well. So, Chris, here's 10 million. Thank you very much. If anyone does have 10 million, see me afterwards. Now, the UK GDP, gross domestic product, is about 2 trillion. So the space budget is currently about 0.02% of UK GDP. A small bit of a small bit of a small bit. The UK population is about 65 million. So we're currently spending 1.5 pence per person per day on space. Doesn't seem very much to me for an insurance policy. I think maybe we're paying a low premium for so we can't be sure what sort of cover we'll get at that rate. The human spaceflight budget is 1.25 pence per person per month. Okay, so a very low insurance premium, that one. And again, I don't think you get a very good cover. I know, third-party cosmic calamity and theft, maybe. Over the same time, as a country, we spent 15 billion on alcohol or tobacco, Now, I don't smoke. I like beer, I like wine. I live in France now, so I've had a chance to, enhance my my interest in white wine in particular, where I live in Alsace. But I still pay tax in the UK. You'd be pleased to know, and in France, it's great. I'd willingly spend all that money on human spaceflight, but so that's 42 times more on alcohol and tobacco, and I haven't even included chocolate and cosmetics into this, than we do on space. So we could double the space budget, spend an extra 290 million on human spaceflight, and we'd still have 14 billion a year left for beer. Seems a pretty good deal to me. I'm prepared to forswear 1 pint of beer a year if it means, preserving the human species. I'm prepared to make a sacrifice. Yeah. And Stephen Hawking proposes actually, a more realistic insurance premium, that we spend 0.25% of our gross domestic product on human spaceflight, which would be 5 billion. Can you imagine what we could achieve if we as a country were to spend 5 billion a year on human spaceflight? We'd have our own space station, our own moon base. We'd have people living and working in space on a permanent basis. I've got to be realistic. I doubt this is going to happen anytime soon, but it gives you a kind of scale of the problem. So, isn't our future worth that much? Shouldn't we at least consider upping the insurance premium that we collectively pay for the continued existence of the human species? Or will we, as they say, go the way of the dinosaurs? So, my question to you is, if not us, who? If not now, when? If we don't start now, by the time whatever bad thing happens, it will be too late. We don't know what's going to happen, we don't know when it's going to happen, but we need to take out insurance now, because you'll find that insurance companies will not sell you insurance after your house is burnt down. They insist on it being beforehand. They're kind of funny like that. I'll be talking about rockets a bit more after lunch, but my basic message is, come with us if you want to live. Let's build a space elevator, okay, if you don't want to travel by rocket, and, let's travel into space. Let's move human beings off the surface of the planet, so if something bad happens to the Earth, we do at least have a chance of continuing the species. So, let's go into space. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. I love the part where you were talking about Carl Sagan and you said, deeply, deeply inspirational. You sounded just like him. So we are fortunate to have one person in the room who has actually been into space. I will concede that they're allowed to vote for Chris. I'm going to appeal to everybody else's votes because I think robots are better than astronauts for exploring the solar system. And I'm going to try and explain to you why I think that's the case. Now, you might be wondering why the words "with apologies to George Orwell" appear on the screen. So just to introduce that thought, the book that he wrote parodying the Russian Revolution called Animal Farm starts off with the pigs taking over the farm from the human farmer. And he persuades, the pigs persuade the other animals to start a chant, which is 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. And one of the central bits of the book is when, at the end of the sort of development of the revolution, the pigs actually evolve into something rather like human beings and start walking on 2 legs. The pigs change the chant to 4 legs good, 2 legs better. So, 4 legs good, 2 legs better, but 8 wheels better still. So, Chris alluded to why we might want to go out into the solar system and beyond in order to survive. And I'll add that to my list here, but potentially we might want to go out there for a variety of different reasons. We might want to look for life on other bodies in the solar system. It might be quite primitive and bacterial, but if it was there, it would be quite significant, I think. We might want to exploit valuable mineral resources. You can find a graphic on the internet of the value of certain asteroids, and they're measured in quintillions of dollars. If you haven't met a quintillion before, and I confess I hadn't, a quintillion is a billion billion, or 10 to the power of 18. That's a lot of money. And potentially we might want to understand some extraterrestrial physics. There are things going on the sun and on some of the other bodies in the solar system that we don't understand. Some of that physics might actually help us do the things that we want to do in the future. But anyway, whatever the answers are to those questions, doesn't matter really why we want to go. I think at the moment it's better to send robots rather than humans because they can get to a lot more places than us. The spacecraft shown top right is a Russian spacecraft that made it to the surface of Venus. The temperature on Venus is enormous, 460 degrees Celsius, and the pressure is about 90 times the atmospheric pressure on Earth. There is no chance you could get a human being to survive those conditions. A robot can do it and has sent pictures back to prove that that's the case. Robots cost a lot less to send. Around the edge of this slide are pictures of various really, really interesting looking places on Mars that I would love to send a spacecraft to. For the cost of just putting one human astronaut on Mars, you could go to all of these different places and explore a whole lot of different types of terrain, a whole lot of different interesting things. Robots will get there quicker because just at the moment, as Chris explained, we've been as far as the moon. It's still looking challenging to get as far as Mars, whereas we've already sent probes to all the major bodies in the solar system as far out as Pluto. New Horizons whistled past Pluto in 2015. And, you know, frankly, I'm a knowledge junkie. I would like to learn more about the solar system in my lifetime. I'm not going to get that information from human explorers. I might get it from robots. Robots don't die on the way. I'm indebted to Dr. Ruth Bamford at the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory for this graphic, which shows the timeline of the Apollo missions from 1968 up to 1972. What's shown on the y-axis here is radiation dose. So this is what you are exposed to down here on the Earth. If you work in the nuclear industry, you might get up to this level. If you're exposed to that sort of radiation level, you will experience temporary radiation sickness, and if you get up to this level, you die. So these blue lines are the dates of the various Apollo missions. And as you can see, there are a couple that get to the point of a couple of solar flare events where you get to the level of radiation sickness. And notice this one between Apollo 16 and 17. If the missions had been timed differently, if the astronauts had been in space when that happened, they would have died. It's that simple. And that's just getting far enough away from the Earth that you're outside the protection of the Valon radiation belts. Simply going to the moon is really, really hazardous. And you can see the frequency of these events. If you're taking a longer mission to Mars, for example, what is the chance that on the way you get fried by the sun? It's going to be quite high. Because of that radiation from the sun, you don't have to live in a hole if you're a robot. This is, for those of us old enough in the room to remember Thunderbirds, fabulous TV series. This is Jerry Anderson's sort of vision of what a lunar base ought to look like. Chris had a picture in his presentation that looked a bit similar with things on the surface. That is not the way to live on the moon. You will get exposed to too much radiation if you live on the surface. You might need to go and live in a hole and put a fair amount of the lunar regolith, the soil of the moon, between you and the radiation. And frankly, the view isn't going to be very good from the bottom of that hole. You need far less logistical support for a robot. A robot can generate power, as Sean explained to us earlier, either using solar panels or a radioisotope thermal generator. That's the source of the electricity that a robot needs to operate. If you're a human being, clearly you need food and water. And it's astonishing how much of the consumables you need to keep a human alive compared to keeping a robot alive in space. Human beings have a limited range of sensors. Andrew talked to us about the fact that only radio waves and optical waves make it through our atmosphere. We don't even exploit the radio waves. We can't hear radio. We only use our eyes to exploit the visual spectrum. Robots, satellites can carry a whole range of sensors all the way across the electromagnetic spectrum that Andrew showed us, from radio all the way out to gamma rays. This is just an example of some of the information that we've gained about the planet Mercury from using cameras that divide the electromagnetic spectrum up in the way that Andrew described, so that we can see the different types of rock and understand more about Mercury than we could if we just looked at it with our own eyes. Robots don't need to sleep. The Curiosity rover that's trundling around on Mars has one of these plutonium-based power sources. It trundles around and does things all the time. And it's got quite an impressive array of instruments because it's nuclear powered. Going back to the stuff we had about biology in space a little earlier, there are two visions of space, and Douglas Adams explained them to us in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. There's the very shiny Heart of Gold type spacecraft where everything is clean and shiny. Star Wars is a bit like that too. This is the Vogon spacecraft with lots of mold. I'm sorry to report, but the reality is actually far more like the Vogon spacecraft. This is the International Space Station. That panel is a very hard picture to find on the internet because the fact that when the astronauts do their exercise, they hang the towels that they use to wipe the sweat off on that panel, and it's going moldy. At the end of the Mir mission, the Mir space station mission, the Russian cosmonauts spent most of their time taking the panels off their electronics boxes in order to clean out the mold that was growing inside. It's not a pretty scenario. Robots are increasingly agile. I'm particularly depressed by, with apologies to the Royal Astronomical Society, who will be speaking to us later, but this is the conclusion from 2005 that humans are considered far better explorers than robots now and are likely to remain so for decades to come, and that's because they were supposedly more agile. Well, this is pictures of astronauts not really coping very well with the gravity that they found on the moon. And I'm sorry, but robots are getting much better, much faster than the Royal Astronomical Society anticipated. This is a robot playing football. There's a robot running upstairs here. You can find videos of robots doing astonishing things on the internet right now. We worry about planetary protection. We think that bacteria can potentially survive the experience of being exposed to space. And so we would like to avoid taking our bacteria to contaminate other places in the solar system. Robots can be cleaned, they can be sterilized before they're sent. There's no way that you could send essentially a bag of bacteria, which is what a human being is, to another object in the solar system and expect it to stay uncontaminated. Robots are also much better at sharing their results. I'm going to argue that the chances that you know anything about what it's like on the moon is not because you heard Buzz Aldrin talking about magnificent desolation, which is what he allegedly said when he first stepped onto the moon, but because they took pictures with a Hasselblad camera, which is a simple robot. It's the pictures like this from the robot that tells you what it's like to be on the moon. They can stay much longer. NASA sent a pair of rovers to Mars a few years ago. Spirit, unfortunately, has died, but its twin Opportunity is still trundling around the Martian surface 13 years after it landed. There's no way a human explorer could stay on Mars for that long. And they don't actually have to come home. This picture is one of the most iconic pictures taken during the Apollo program. It was taken by Michael Collins. He's on the command module, and in the ascent vehicle that's coming up to rendezvous with him are Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. When he was asked about his emotions on taking this iconic picture, Michael Collins said, well, I had two thoughts, he said. One was a sense of relief. We hadn't been able to test the ascent motor, so I was particularly pleased that my two colleagues were actually coming up from the lunar surface to rendezvous with me because I really didn't want to make the journey home on my own. But he said the other thought that I had was that with my two colleagues in the capsule in front of me and the Earth in the background, I had the whole of humanity in my camera frame except me, which I thought was an interesting thought. And robots can even do science when they're dead. This is a wonderful example of repurposing. So this is a Russian rover, the one that I had on my first slide. It's called Lunokhod. This thing here is a laser retroreflector experiment. What the Russians wanted to do was measure the distance to the moon very accurately by bouncing a laser off that particular piece of kit and measure the time that it took the laser light to go back and forwards to the moon to get a very accurate measure of the distance. Problem was, when they landed this stuff on the moon in the early 1970s, they didn't have a very good map of the moon. So even when this thing started sending back pictures from its cameras, they weren't able to figure out exactly where it was, so they couldn't aim their laser accurately enough to get a return from this. However, long after it died, the Americans put a mission called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, into orbit around the moon. It took a very high-resolution set of pictures of the moon, and they found the tracks of the Lunokhod rover, and they found the rover itself, obviously at the end of the tracks where it broke down. So they thought, well, now we know exactly where the Lunokhod rover is, let's try firing a laser at it. So they did, and they got a return. And now you can use that particular piece of kit on that rover to do experiments today. So I've decided that Chris has complained about this. He thinks that me taking anthropomorphic robots is cheating in some way. But, I mean, let's face it, Wally is a lot cuter than I am, and I need help here, okay? When we did this at the British Interplanetary Society, one of the people in the audience, when we took questions, said, so if you don't believe in sending humans out there immediately and you would prefer robots, well, what's the future? And I said, well, you know, frankly, human beings are a bit squidgy for space. We need something with a bit more resilience. We need to try and perhaps evolve ourselves or something into something that has some of the resilience of a robot and some of the capabilities of a human being. And I thought, well, I've got Wally as an example of the robot, and I have Chris as an example of a human being that would like to go into space. So I thought, let's put them together and see what we get. So here are my two prototypes, and this is their love child. Thank you very much. And now it's down to you, Chris. So we're going to take a vote. What should we ask for first?
Well,
Let's go for it. Who would send robots? Ooh. Who would send people? We could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I'd say that was close to a draw. What do you think?
I think there's a few more on the human side. But it's close, mate. Certainly closer than I would have hoped. But,
yes, I got more roboteers than I thought I might. Yeah. Thank you very much. In order to try and get back on schedule, we've lost about 10 minutes this morning, but if it's okay with you, come back at 2 o'clock. I have a very light-hearted quiz. It's not hard, and it's all sort of either-or type questions, so it's a 50-50 chance on every question. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist yet in order to do okay in the quiz. See you at 2 o'clock. Thank you.